December 23, 1944. Dawn breaks cold and reluctant over the Ardennes forest. Inside the cramped cockpit of a C-47 Skytrain, ice crystallizes along the edges of the windshield. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines drone in mechanical rhythm, a sound both comforting and isolating at 2,500 feet. Below, the snow-covered hills of Belgium spread like wrinkled linen, deceptively peaceful from this height. First Lieutenant James Kearns leans over his navigation table, a pencil stub gripped between cold fingers. The map before him shows the approved flight corridor, a wide arc that skirts known German flak positions. Red circles mark enemy concentrations. Safe zones are shaded green. But Kearns has drawn something else. A thin line in graphite cuts straight through the red zones, threading between two German-held villages, following a river valley that official orders have marked with a single word: forbidden. Behind him, the cargo bay holds 4 tons of medical supplies, ammunition, and plasma, enough to keep 1,000 men alive for 3 more days. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, Bastogne waits, encircled, bleeding, running out of time. Kearns folds the map. His hand moves to the intercom switch. "Pilot," he says quietly, "I have an alternate route." 7 days earlier, the German army had done something the Allied command believed impossible. On December 16th, 3 entire German armies punched through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, a sector considered so quiet it was nicknamed the Ghost Front. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, surged westward through the fog-shrouded forests. The goal was audacious: split the Allied forces in 2, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the full weight of American industrial power could crush the Third Reich. Hitler himself had planned the offensive, betting everything on surprise, speed, and winter weather that would ground Allied aircraft. For the first 48 hours, it worked. American units scattered or surrendered. Entire regiments found themselves cut off, surrounded by panzer columns that materialized out of the fog like steel ghosts. Communication lines snapped. Supply dumps burned. The front, which had been moving steadily eastward since D-Day, suddenly reversed direction, but not everywhere. At a small Belgian market town called Bastogne, something unexpected happened. The 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from Operation Market Garden, received emergency orders on December 17th. They were to move immediately to Bastogne and hold the town at all costs. The paratroopers loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night, many without proper winter gear, some without ammunition. They reached Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces encircled the town completely. Bastogne mattered because 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled those roads controlled movement through the Ardennes. The Germans needed Bastogne to maintain their westward momentum. The Americans needed it to anchor their defense and eventually counterattack. By December 20th, the 101st Airborne and attached units found themselves completely surrounded by elements of 5 German divisions, including the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division. Inside the perimeter, approximately 12,000 American soldiers dug into frozen ground and prepared to hold. They had some advantages. The town itself provided shelter. The surrounding terrain, with its rolling hills and thick forests, favored defense. And the paratroopers were elite troops, accustomed to operating behind enemy lines. But they also faced crushing disadvantages. They had arrived with minimal supplies. Artillery ammunition was already being rationed by December 23rd. Medical supplies were critically low, with wounded men lying 2 and 3 to a stretcher. Food stocks would last perhaps 4 days under strict rationing, and the weather refused to cooperate. Heavy fog, snow, and low clouds blanketed the Ardennes. No aircraft could fly. No supplies could be dropped. No reinforcements could arrive by air. The 101st was on its own, and everyone inside the perimeter knew it. German artillery pounded American positions around the clock. Panzer units probed for weak points. The cold was merciless, dropping below freezing every night, turning foxholes into ice-lined graves for men who fell asleep on watch. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the German 47th Panzer Corps. The message was formal and direct. Surrender Bastogne within 2 hours, or face complete annihilation. The Germans promised honorable treatment for prisoners, and warned that continued resistance would result in total destruction of the town and everyone in it. The ultimatum reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. McAuliffe read it, laughed, and spoke a single word that would become legendary: nuts. When staff officers asked what official reply should be sent, McAuliffe shrugged. "That's my reply. Tell them to go to hell." The typed response, delivered to bewildered German officers, read simply, "To the German commander." Nuts! The American commander. The Germans required a translation. When they understood, they withdrew in silence. The shelling intensified. By the morning of December 23rd, the situation inside Bastogne had become desperate. Artillery crews were down to 10 rounds per gun. Medics performed surgeries with supplies scavenged from dead soldiers. Plasma, critical for treating shock and blood loss, had run out completely. Men with severe wounds died not from their injuries, but from the lack of basic medical care. The aid stations, housed in cellars and damaged buildings, smelled of gangrene and disinfectant. Surgeons worked by candlelight, their hands numb from cold, making decisions no doctor should have to make about who would receive treatment and who would be made comfortable. Food had become a mathematical problem. Each soldier received 1 meal per day, often just a can of cold beans or a slice of bread. Tank crews siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles to keep their remaining Shermans running. Infantry platoons shared single blankets, frostbite cases mounted alongside combat casualties, filling the already overwhelmed aid stations with men whose blackened fingers and toes required amputation. The perimeter held, but barely. Every German attack pushed a little deeper. Every American counterattack used ammunition that could not be replaced. Outside the perimeter, the 9th Air Force and Royal Air Force had been trying to reach Bastogne since December 19th, but the weather made it impossible. Dense fog reduced visibility to less than a quarter mile. Cloud ceilings dropped below 500 feet. Ice formed on aircraft wings before they even left the ground. Pilots sat in ready rooms, staring at weather reports, watching the hours tick away. Transport crews loaded C-47s with supplies, then unloaded them when missions were scrubbed. The supplies sat on airfields in England and France while men died 30 miles away. The standard resupply route for Bastogne had been carefully planned. Aircraft would fly from bases in France, cross into Belgium at a safe altitude, then descend for a low-level approach to the drop zone. The route avoided known German flak concentrations, skirting east of Saint-Vith and west of the main German thrust. Intelligence officers had marked the safe corridors on maps distributed to every transport squadron. These corridors were updated daily based on reconnaissance reports and pilot debriefings. But the Germans understood those routes as well as the Americans did. By December 22nd, Wehrmacht flak units had repositioned specifically to cover the expected approach paths. 88mm guns, deadly accurate up to 25,000 feet, were dug into hillsides overlooking the valleys that transport aircraft would have to use. Lighter 20mm and 37mm guns covered the lower altitudes. German commanders knew that once the weather cleared, the Americans would attempt a massive resupply effort. They prepared to turn the skies over Bastogne into a killing zone. On the evening of December 22nd, meteorologists detected a change. A high-pressure system was moving in from the west. The fog would lift. The clouds would break. By dawn on December 23rd, the weather would be clear enough for flight operations. Orders went out immediately. Every available C-47 would fly to Bastogne. Fighter escorts would provide cover. It would be the largest aerial resupply operation of the war. But there was a problem embedded in the plan. The safe routes, the ones marked in green on every map, would take aircraft directly over German positions that were now reinforced and waiting. Pilots and navigators knew this. They had seen the reconnaissance photos. They had read the intelligence summaries. The approved corridors were no longer safe. They were predicted, anticipated, and targeted. Flying those routes would mean flying into a prepared ambush. Some crews requested permission to deviate from the standard flight paths. They proposed alternative approaches, using terrain features for cover, flying lower and faster to avoid radar detection. But the requests were denied. The 9th Air Force had learned hard lessons about unauthorized route changes. Earlier in the war, pilots who deviated from approved corridors had been shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire or had collided with other aircraft. Discipline required adherence to the plan. The routes were approved for a reason. Crews would follow them. First Lieutenant James Kearns, navigator aboard a C-47 designated as Ship 34, studied the maps throughout the night of December 22nd. He had flown 12 resupply missions over France in the months since D-Day. He understood terrain navigation, how valleys and rivers could mask an aircraft from ground observers, how the angle of approach affected vulnerability to flak. And he saw something on the map that the intelligence officers had missed or dismissed: a narrow valley, barely 2 miles wide, that cut through the German-held territory almost directly to Bastogne. The valley followed the Orth River, twisting between hills that would hide an aircraft flying at low altitude. No major roads paralleled the river, meaning fewer German troops and lighter flak concentrations. But the valley was marked forbidden. The notation indicated that the route passed too close to known German positions, that the terrain was too restrictive for safe flight, that any aircraft entering the valley would be trapped if intercepted. The orders were explicit: no deviations, no unauthorized routes. Stick to the approved corridors or face court-martial. Kearns traced the valley with his pencil, calculating distances, altitudes, and time over target. The math was compelling. The forbidden route would cut 15 minutes off the flight time and avoid the heaviest German defenses. But it would also require flying at treetop level, navigating by visual reference alone, and maintaining absolute radio silence. One mistake, one wrong turn, and the aircraft would fly directly into a hillside or emerge over a German flak position with no altitude for evasive maneuvers. He folded the map and tried to sleep. But the numbers kept running through his mind. 15 minutes. 4 tons of supplies. 1,000 men waiting. James Kearns was 24 years old, a farmer's son from Iowa who had learned navigation by watching the stars over cornfields. He had enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, drawn by the promise of flying and a recruiter's assurance that navigators were the brains of any bomber crew. His training at Hondo Army Airfield in Texas had been rigorous and technical, focused on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and map reading. Instructors drilled into their students that a navigator's job was precision, not creativity. Follow the charts. Trust the instruments. Never improvise. Kearns had been a good student, graduating in the top quarter of his class. But he had also been noted in his evaluations for what his instructors called independent thinking, a phrase that was neither compliment nor criticism. On training flights, Kearns would occasionally suggest alternate routes that saved fuel or time. His calculations were always correct. His suggestions always worked. But they were still deviations, and the Army did not encourage deviation. He arrived in England in August 1944 and was assigned to the 439th Troop Carrier Group, part of the 9th Air Force. The 439th had flown on D-Day, dropping paratroopers over Normandy in the darkness before the beach landings. By the time Kearns joined, the group was flying resupply missions, shuttling ammunition, fuel, and food to forward units across France. It was considered safe work, flying over friendly territory, landing at secured airfields. Kearns flew 40 missions between August and December without seeing enemy fire. But Bastogne was different. This would not be a landing. It would be a combat drop. Supplies pushed out the cargo door while the aircraft flew over hostile ground. And the men waiting below were not rear-echelon supply clerks. They were paratroopers, Kearns's own branch of service, surrounded and dying. That changed the calculation. That made the risk personal. The tactical problem facing every crew on the morning of December 23rd was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. Transport aircraft were slow, unarmed, and made of aluminum skin thin enough to be pierced by rifle bullets. They could not outrun fighters. They could not defend themselves against flak. Their only protection was altitude, speed, and unpredictability. The approved routes provided altitude and a semblance of unpredictability through predetermined course changes. But they sacrificed speed, adding nearly 30 minutes to the flight time, 30 minutes spent exposed to enemy fire. German flak batteries operated on a simple principle. Observers on the ground tracked aircraft visually or by sound. They estimated altitude, speed, and direction. Gunners calculated lead time and fuse settings. Then they fired shells that exploded at a predetermined altitude, filling the sky with shrapnel. Against a single aircraft, flak was relatively ineffective. But against a formation of slow-moving transports following a predictable route, flak could be devastating. The Germans did not need to score direct hits. They just needed to fill the air with steel fragments and wait for aircraft to fly through it. Intelligence reports indicated at least 30 heavy flak batteries positioned along the approved routes. Each battery consisted of 4 to 6 guns. Each gun could fire 15 rounds per minute. That meant, in theory, American transports would be flying through a sky filled with thousands of exploding shells. Crews were briefed to expect losses. 10% was considered acceptable. 20% was possible. No one said what would happen if the losses exceeded 30%, but everyone understood. The mission would be called off. Bastogne would be left to its fate. Kearns had studied the maps long enough to see the pattern. The approved routes followed major valleys and avoided high terrain, which made sense for safety, but also made them predictable. German commanders did not need sophisticated intelligence to guess where American aircraft would fly. They just needed to look at a topographic map and position their guns accordingly. It was the same principle as setting up an ambush on a road. You did not need to know when the convoy was coming. You just needed to know which road it would use. The forbidden route, the valley that followed the Orthe River, avoided that predictability. It was narrow, twisting, and followed terrain that transport pilots would normally avoid. But that was precisely why it might work. The Germans would not expect aircraft there. They would not have positioned heavy flak batteries in a location where targets would appear for only seconds at a time. The valley was forbidden not because it was more dangerous, but because it was more difficult. And difficulty, Kearns believed, could be an advantage. But believing it and convincing his pilot were two different things. Captain Robert Brennan, the aircraft commander, was 32 years old, a veteran of the North Africa campaign, and a man who followed orders with the precision of a clock. Brennan had flown over Normandy on D-Day, through flak so thick it looked like black clouds. He had seen aircraft disintegrate, had watched parachutes blossom from burning planes, had landed back in England with holes in his fuselage large enough to crawl through. He survived by being cautious, methodical, and obedient. Kearns knew that proposing an unauthorized route to Brennan would be difficult, but he also knew that Brennan cared about his crew and the men they were trying to save. If the argument was framed correctly, if the math was clear and the logic sound, Brennan might listen. It was a gamble. But then again, flying the approved route was also a gamble. At least this way, the odds might be better. Inside Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne had no idea that a debate over navigation routes was taking place. They only knew that the fog had lifted. For the first time in 6 days, sunlight touched the frozen ground. Soldiers looked up at the clear sky with something between hope and fear. Hope because clear skies meant resupply aircraft. Fear because clear skies also meant German bombers. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Connor, a squad leader with Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, crouched in a foxhole on the northeast perimeter. He had been in Bastogne since December 19th. In 4 days, he had slept perhaps 6 hours total. His squad had started with 12 men. Now it was down to 8. 2 killed. 2 wounded badly enough to be evacuated to the aid station, which really just meant moved to a cellar where they might die more slowly. O'Connor's greatest concern was not the Germans. It was ammunition. His men had 10 rounds each for their M1 Garands. He had 3 clips left for his Thompson submachine gun. If the Germans attacked in force, they could hold for maybe 10 minutes before being overrun. The platoon commander had issued orders that morning. Do not fire unless you have a clear target. Do not waste ammunition on harassing fire. Make every shot count. It was the kind of order that made sense logically, but felt impossible to follow when tracers were snapping past your head. Medical supplies had become a form of currency more valuable than cigarettes or whiskey. O'Connor had a single morphine syringe in his first aid pouch, saved for an injury serious enough to warrant its use. Other men had already used theirs, either on themselves or on wounded comrades. The aid stations had run out of morphine on December 21st. Doctors were performing amputations with soldiers biting down on leather belts, their screams echoing through the stone cellars. When O'Connor heard aircraft engines on the morning of December 23rd, he thought at first it was German bombers. Everyone dove for cover. But then someone shouted that they were C-47s, American transports. The sky filled with aircraft, dozens of them, flying in formation toward the drop zone. Parachutes blossomed, red and white and yellow, each color coding a different type of supply. Bundles tumbled from open cargo doors, spinning down toward the snow-covered fields. But O'Connor also saw the flak. Black puffs of smoke appeared around the aircraft, scattered at first, then clustering thicker as German gunners found their range. One C-47 took a direct hit, its right engine exploding in a spray of fire and metal. The aircraft nosed down and disappeared behind the tree line. Another transport, trailing smoke, turned away from the formation and limped eastward. O'Connor did not know if it made it back. Still, the supplies came down. Recovery teams, men designated to sprint into the open and retrieve the bundles, ran from cover the moment the parachutes touched ground. They worked under German artillery fire, dragging the heavy bundles back to foxholes and trucks. Some bundles landed outside the perimeter, in German-held territory, and had to be abandoned. Others landed in trees or tore open on impact, scattering their contents across the frozen ground. But enough made it through. Enough to matter. O'Connor's squad received a resupply bundle that afternoon. Inside were bandoliers of M1 ammunition, grenades, a case of K rations, and 2 boxes of morphine syrettes. The morphine went immediately to the platoon medic, who clutched the boxes like they were made of gold. The ammunition was distributed equally, each man receiving 50 rounds. The K rations were saved for later. Food mattered less than bullets. That evening, German infantry attacked O'Connor's sector. This time, when the tracers came, he fired back. His men fired back. They held the line, not through bravery or superior tactics, but because they had enough ammunition to do so. The attack broke apart after 30 minutes. German soldiers withdrew, leaving their dead in the snow. O'Connor reloaded his Thompson and waited for the next attack. He did not know which aircraft had dropped the supplies that saved his squad. He did not know the names of the crew or the route they had flown. He only knew that someone had made it through. From the German perspective, the sudden clear weather on December 23rd was a disaster. Luftwaffe commanders had counted on fog and clouds to neutralize Allied air superiority. Now, American and British aircraft filled the skies, not just transports, but fighters and bombers. The German advance, which had relied on speed and concealment, suddenly found itself exposed and vulnerable. Panzer columns that had moved freely through the forests now faced strafing runs by P-47 Thunderbolts. Supply convoys were bombed on the roads. Communication lines were cut by airstrikes. Major Hans Becker commanded a flak battery positioned northeast of Bastogne, part of the 3rd Flak Division. His 4 88mm guns had been moved into position on December 21st, specifically to cover the expected American resupply routes. Becker was an experienced officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, who understood how Allied air forces operated. He had studied their tactics, their formations, their altitudes. He positioned his guns on high ground with overlapping fields of fire, exactly where doctrine dictated. When the first wave of American transports appeared on December 23rd, Becker's guns opened fire immediately. The results were satisfying. His battery claimed 2 confirmed kills in the first hour, both C-47s that fell in flames. But Becker also noticed something odd. Some aircraft were not following the expected routes. A few transports, flying singly or in pairs, appeared from unexpected directions, hugging the terrain, disappearing into valleys, and re-emerging seconds later over the drop zone. These aircraft were harder to target, their altitude and speed constantly changing. Becker's gunners fired at them but scored no hits. It frustrated him professionally. Doctrine stated that transport aircraft would follow predictable routes to maintain formation integrity and avoid mid-air collisions. These lone aircraft were violating doctrine, which meant they were either lost or deliberately deviating from their flight plans. Becker suspected the latter. Some American crews, he realized, were improvising, taking risks that their commanders probably had not authorized. It was the kind of individual initiative that Germans both respected and feared in American soldiers. That afternoon, Becker received orders to reposition his battery. Allied fighter bombers had spotted his guns and were preparing a strike. He limbered the 88s onto their towing vehicles and moved 3 kilometers south, closer to Bastogne itself. From the new position, he could still cover the drop zone, but with less effectiveness. The constant relocation, the fear of airstrikes, the realization that the Luftwaffe could not protect ground forces, all of it indicated that the offensive was failing. Bastogne should have fallen by now. Instead, it was being resupplied. The Americans were holding, and the clear skies that had been supposed to last. Only one day showed no signs of deteriorating. Ship 34 lifted off from Mourmelon-le-Grand airfield in northeastern France at 0547 hours on December 23rd. Captain Brennan held the yoke steady as the C-47 climbed into the pale dawn, the heavily loaded aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. Behind him, the cargo bay held 4 tons of supplies: plasma, bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, ammunition boxes, and ration crates, all secured with cargo nets and straps. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant William Hayes, crouched in the back, double-checking the rigging on the parachute bundles. Kearns sat at his navigation table, maps spread before him, dividers and pencil in hand. The flight plan called for a heading of 045 degrees, climbing to 6,000 feet, then turning to 070 degrees to join the main formation. The approved route would take them northeast, skirting the German salient, then curving back toward Bastogne from the north. Total flight time: 90 minutes. But Kearns had not stopped thinking about the alternative. The Forbidden Valley, the Ortha River route. He had calculated every turn, every altitude change, every minute saved. He had identified visual reference points, hills and villages and road junctions that would confirm their position without relying on radio navigation. The route was possible. He was certain of it, but certainty was not the same as permission. At 6,000 feet, Brennan leveled off and glanced back at Kearns. "Give me a heading, Lieutenant." This was the moment. Kearns could read off the approved course, and they would follow the standard route with 100 other aircraft, flying through flak that had been pre-positioned and calibrated for exactly their altitude and speed. Or he could propose the alternative and hope that Brennan trusted him enough to consider it. "Sir," Kearns said, his voice steady over the intercom, "I have an alternate route. Cuts 15 minutes off our flight time and avoids the main German flak concentrations." Silence filled the intercom. Brennan stared ahead through the windshield, his hands resting on the yoke. Finally, he spoke. "The approved route is approved for a reason, Jim." "Yes, sir. But the Germans know the approved route. They've had 4 days to reposition their guns. We'll be flying into a prepared kill zone." "And your alternate route goes where, exactly?" Kearns unfolded the map and held it up where Brennan could see. "Through this valley, following the Orthe River. Low altitude, terrain masking, radio silence. We come in from the east where they're not expecting us." Brennan studied the map. "That valley's marked forbidden." "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what happens if we deviate from the flight plan?" "Court-martial, sir. Loss of wings. Dishonorable discharge." Brennan nodded slowly. Then he looked back at Kearns, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. "What's our heading, Lieutenant?" Kearns felt something release in his chest. 090 degrees, sir. Descend to 1,000 feet as we approach the river." Brennan banked the aircraft to the right, breaking away from the forming gaggle of transports. Behind them, other C-47s climbed in loose formation, dozens of them, all following the approved route north. Ship 34 turned east, alone, and began to descend. The Ardennes forest passed beneath them, an endless expanse of snow-covered trees broken occasionally by roads and villages. Kearns navigated by visual reference, identifying landmarks and comparing them to his map. A stone church, a railway line, a cluster of farm buildings. Each one confirmed their position, kept them on course. Brennan flew low and fast, the altimeter reading 800 feet, then 600, then 500. The trees seemed close enough to touch. They crossed into the valley at 612 hours. The terrain rose on both sides, steep hills covered in pine and fir. The river, a silver ribbon winding through the center. Brennan dropped even lower, until the aircraft was flying barely 200 feet above the water. At this altitude, German radar could not track them. Observers on the ground would hear the engines but see nothing until the aircraft was already past. It was dangerous flying, threading through a narrow corridor with no room for error. But it was also invisible. Kearns called out heading changes as the valley twisted. Left 5 degrees. Hold it. Steady. Right 10 degrees. Brennan responded instantly, banking the aircraft, correcting, keeping them centered over the river. Hayes, in the cargo bay, braced himself against the bulkhead, feeling every turn in his stomach. They passed a German supply column on a road paralleling the river. Trucks and half-tracks, at least 20 vehicles crawling eastward. Brennan saw them at the same moment as Kearns. For 3 seconds, the C-47 flew directly over the column, low enough that soldiers on the ground looked up in shock. Some raised rifles. A few fired. Bullets pinged against the aluminum fuselage, but none struck anything critical. Then the aircraft was passed, around a bend in the valley, gone before the Germans could organize proper fire. "We just flew over a whole damn convoy," Hayes said over the intercom, his voice tight. "They'll report it," Brennan replied. "But by the time anyone responds, we'll be long gone." The valley widened ahead. Kearns checked his map, measuring distances with his dividers. 2 minutes to the drop zone, sir. Climb to 500 feet and reduce speed to 120. Brennan pulled back on the yoke, the C-47 climbing gradually, the engines roaring with the increased load. The valley opened into rolling farmland, and suddenly Bastogne was visible ahead, a cluster of buildings and church steeples surrounded by a perimeter of foxholes and defensive positions. Smoke rose from multiple locations, evidence of artillery fire and burning vehicles. And then the flak started. The first burst appeared 100 yards to the left, a black puff of smoke that blossomed and dissipated in seconds. Brennan did not flinch. He held the aircraft steady, lined up on the drop zone, a field marked with white panels arranged in a T-shape. Kearns called out altitude and airspeed, his voice calm, professional, detached from the fact that they were flying through exploding shells. Hayes moved to the cargo door, yanking the handle and sliding it open. Cold air blasted into the cabin, howling over the engine noise. He positioned himself next to the first supply bundle, his hand on the release strap, waiting for the signal. Below, the ground rushed past, white snow and dark trees and the shapes of men running toward the drop zone. More flak bursts, closer now, 2 on the right, 1 directly ahead. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel ripped through the tail section. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. Brennan ignored them. The drop zone was 30 seconds ahead. They would make the drop. Then they would worry about damage. 20 seconds, Kearns said. Hayes braced his legs and tightened his grip on the strap. The supply bundles were rigged with static lines that would deploy the parachutes automatically as they fell. His job was simple: kick them out the door in sequence, as fast as possible, while the aircraft remained over the drop zone. 15 seconds of work. 15 seconds that could mean life or death for 1,000 men. 10 seconds. The aircraft bucked as another shell exploded beneath it, the concussion lifting the right wing. Brennan fought the yoke, leveling out, holding the heading. The drop zone passed beneath them, white panels bright against the snow. Drop! 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 Hayes kicked the first bundle. It tumbled out the door, the static line snapping taut, the parachute blossoming red against the gray sky. Second bundle, third, fourth. He moved in a rhythm, kicking and releasing, not thinking, just executing the task. The bundles fell in a line, parachutes opening, supplies drifting down toward the waiting soldiers. 10th bundle. 11th. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, and Hayes heard the metallic screech of shrapnel tearing through aluminum. He glanced up and saw a hole in the ceiling of the cargo bay, daylight streaming through, edges jagged and sharp. "We're hit!" he shouted into the intercom. "Keep dropping!" Brennan's voice, tight but controlled. 12th bundle. 13th. 14th. The last supply bundle slid toward the door. Hayes kicked it clear and watched it fall. Then he grabbed the door frame and hauled the cargo door shut, locking it in place. All bundles away. Brennan banked the aircraft hard to the left, diving for the cover of the valley. The flak followed them, bursts stitching the sky where they had been seconds before. But the aircraft was accelerating now, dropping altitude, racing back toward the protection of the terrain. Kearns navigated in reverse, calling out headings that would take them back through the forbidden valley, back to friendly airspace. The right engine was running rough, the oil pressure gauge showing a slow drop. A fuel line had been nicked, leaking fluid that streamed back over the wing, evaporating in the slipstream. But the engine was still running. The controls still responded. They were damaged, but flyable. Behind them, on the ground outside Bastogne, recovery teams sprinted toward the supply bundles. Soldiers cut away parachutes and dragged the bundles toward waiting trucks. Some bundles had landed inside the perimeter, perfect drops. Others had landed in no man's land within rifle range of German positions and had to be retrieved under fire. One bundle landed directly on a foxhole, crushing the parachute but leaving the supplies intact. The soldiers inside the foxhole emerged, shaken but unhurt, and began distributing ammunition to their squad mates. Staff Sergeant O'Connor's platoon received supplies from Ship 34's drop. They did not know the aircraft's designation or the names of its crew. They only knew that someone had made it through the flak, had dropped supplies accurately, and had given them a chance to keep fighting. O'Connor opened a bundle and found bandoliers of ammunition, ration boxes, and a case of plasma. He personally carried the plasma to the nearest aid station, where a doctor accepted it with a nod and immediately began using it on a soldier who was fading from blood loss. Ship 34 flew back through the valley at full throttle, Brennan pushing the engines as hard as he dared with one already damaged. They passed the German convoy again, but this time the soldiers on the ground were ready. Anti-aircraft fire followed the C-47, tracers arcing up from multiple positions, but the aircraft was too low and too fast. By the time the gunners adjusted their aim, the C-47 was already out of range. They cleared the valley at 06:34 hours, 22 minutes after entering it. Brennan climbed to 2,000 feet and turned west, heading for friendly territory. The right engine was still losing oil pressure, the gauge needle dropping steadily. Brennan calculated distances and fuel consumption, running numbers in his head. They could make it back to Mourmelon if the engine held. If it failed, they would have to find an emergency landing site. Kearns folded his map and stowed his navigation tools. His hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with him. He had been calm during the approach, focused during the drop, detached in the way that training had taught him to be. But now, with the mission complete and the danger receding, the reality of what they had done settled over him. They had violated direct orders. They had flown an unauthorized route. They had survived, and the supplies had been delivered. But none of that would matter if the Army decided to prosecute. "Good work, Jim," Brennan said quietly over the intercom. Kearns nodded, though Brennan could not see him. "Thank you, sir." They crossed into Allied airspace at 07:01 hours. The engine held. The fuel lasted. Ship 34 landed at Mourmelon-le-Grand at 07:42 hours, the right engine smoking, the fuselage riddled with shrapnel holes, but intact. Ground crews surrounded the aircraft immediately, counting the damage, shaking their heads in disbelief that it had made it back. Brennan shut down the engines and sat in silence for a moment. Then he climbed out of the cockpit, dropped to the tarmac, and walked away without speaking to anyone. Hayes and Kearns followed. They did not discuss the flight. They did not debrief. They simply walked to their barracks, lay down on their bunks, and tried to process what had just happened. 3 hours later, they were summoned to the squadron commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Jarvis commanded the 92nd Troop Carrier Squadron, the unit to which Ship 34 belonged. He was a career officer, 41 years old, a man who believed in discipline and order and the chain of command. When his operations officer reported that one of his aircraft had deviated from the approved flight plan, Jarvis was not pleased. He sat behind his desk, Brennan and Kearns standing at attention before him. The office was sparse, military functional, a map of Europe on the wall and stacks of reports on the desk. Jarvis did not invite them to sit. "Captain Brennan," Jarvis began, his voice flat, "you violated a direct order. You flew an unauthorized route. You placed your aircraft, your crew, and the mission at risk. Do you have anything to say?" Brennan stared at the wall behind Jarvis. "Sir, we delivered our supplies to the drop zone. All bundles were dropped accurately. The mission was successful." "That is not what I asked." "No, sir." Jarvis turned his attention to Kearns. "Lieutenant, did you advise Captain Brennan to deviate from the approved route?" Kearns met Jarvis's eyes. "Sir, I presented an alternative route based on my analysis of enemy flak positions and terrain features. Captain Brennan made the final decision. An alternative route that was explicitly marked as forbidden." "Yes, sir." Jarvis leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he opened a folder on his desk and pulled out a report. "Your aircraft sustained 17 shrapnel hits. Your right engine has a damaged oil line and will require replacement. Your tail section has structural damage. You flew over a German supply column at low altitude, violating noise discipline and alerting enemy forces to aerial activity in that sector. He paused, letting the list of violations sink in. Then he continued. You also delivered 4 tons of supplies directly onto the drop zone with 0 bundles lost to enemy fire or inaccurate placement. Your drop was one of the most accurate of the entire mission, and you did it while sustaining less damage than aircraft that followed the approved routes. 3 C-47s were shot down this morning following standard procedures. Yours was not. Brennan and Kearns remained silent. Jarvis closed the folder. I am obligated to report this incident to higher command. I am also obligated to note that your unauthorized route may have saved your crew and ensured mission success. Those 2 facts will be included in my report. Dismissed. They saluted and left the office. Neither spoke until they were outside, walking across the airfield. Finally, Brennan glanced at Kearns. We might still get court-martialed. Yes, sir. Was it worth it? Kearns thought about the men in Bastogne, the soldiers who had received the supplies, the doctors who had used the plasma, the riflemen who had fired the ammunition. He thought about O'Connor's squad and the thousands of others like it, men who had needed those supplies to survive another day. Yes, sir, he said. It was worth it. That afternoon, other crews began asking questions. They had seen Ship 34 return alone, had noticed the damage, had heard rumors about an unauthorized route. Navigators studied their maps, looking for alternatives to the approved corridors. Pilots debated whether the risk of deviation was justified by the potential reduction in losses. By evening, the rumor had spread through the entire troop carrier group. Someone had found a better way. Someone had proven that the approved routes were not the only option. The commanders tried to suppress the talk, reiterating that all crews were to follow standard procedures. But the idea, once planted, could not be uprooted. Discipline was important, but so was survival. On December 24th, the resupply missions continued. The weather remained clear. Hundreds of sorties were flown, dropping over 300 tons of supplies into Bastogne. The loss rate among transport aircraft remained high, but not catastrophic, and a few crews, acting on their own initiative, deviated from the approved routes. They flew lower, faster, using terrain masking and unpredictable approaches. Not all of them succeeded, but enough did that the tactic could not be ignored. Inside Bastogne, the resupply effort made an immediate difference. Ammunition stocks stabilized. Medical personnel had the supplies they needed to save lives. Food improved morale. The perimeter held, not just against German attacks, but psychologically. The men of the 101st Airborne knew they had not been abandoned. Help was coming from the sky, even if it arrived through flak and fire. On December 26th, elements of General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The 101st Airborne had held for 7 days against overwhelming odds, and they had held in part because supplies had reached them when they needed them most. The official casualty figures told part of the story. The 101st Airborne and attached units suffered approximately 1,500 casualties during the siege, including over 200 killed. But medical officers estimated that the number would have been significantly higher without the aerial resupply missions on December 23rd and 24. Plasma alone saved an estimated 300 lives, preventing shock and blood loss that would otherwise have been fatal. The ammunition delivered by air enabled counterattacks that disrupted German assault preparations. The food and medical supplies sustained morale and physical capability. The psychological impact of seeing American aircraft overhead, of knowing that support was coming, was immeasurable but real. Soldiers fought harder when they believed they had a chance. The resupply missions gave them that chance. Lieutenant Colonel Jarvis's report on Ship 34's unauthorized route reached 9th Air Force Headquarters in late December. It was reviewed by operations staff, intelligence officers, and senior commanders. The response was mixed. Some officers argued for disciplinary action, citing the need for operational discipline and adherence to approved procedures. Others argued that results mattered more than process, that innovative thinking should be encouraged rather than punished. In the end, no charges were filed. Captain Brennan and Lieutenant Kearns received official reprimands for deviating from the flight plan, notations that would remain in their service records. But they also received commendations for successful completion of their mission under combat conditions. The contradictory messages reflected the larger tension within military doctrine, the need for discipline versus the value of initiative. Kearns flew 14 more missions before the war ended in May 1945. He never again deviated from approved routes, but he also never forgot the flight to Bastogne, the Forbidden Valley, the feeling of threading an aircraft through terrain that doctrine said was too dangerous. He had proven that rules, while important, were not infallible, and that sometimes survival required thinking beyond the approved plan. After the war, Kearns returned to Iowa and resumed farming. He rarely spoke about his service, and when he did, he focused on the routine flights, the uneventful missions. The flight to Bastogne remained private, a memory he revisited alone. He corresponded briefly with Brennan, who had settled in Oregon and worked as a commercial pilot. Hayes, the crew chief, stayed in the Air Force and retired as a master sergeant in 1962. In 1984, 40 years after the siege of Bastogne, Kearns received an invitation to attend a reunion of the 101st Airborne Division. He almost declined. He had not been a paratrooper. He had not fought in the perimeter. But the invitation specifically mentioned the aircrew of the resupply missions, recognizing their contribution to the defense of Bastogne. He attended, and there he met Staff Sergeant Michael O'Connor, retired, 63 years old, who had been in easy company during the siege. They spoke for 2 hours. O'Connor described the morning of December 23rd, the clear sky, the C-47s overhead, the bundles drifting down. He described opening a supply bundle and finding ammunition and plasma, supplies that had kept his squad fighting, that had saved lives in the aid station. "I never knew who flew those planes," O'Connor said. "I just knew someone got through." Kearns nodded. He thought about telling O'Connor the full story, the forbidden route, the decision in the cockpit, the valley flight, but he did not. It seemed unnecessary. The supplies had arrived. The mission had succeeded. The details of navigation were just details. "We got through," he said simply, and that was enough. The tactical innovation represented by Ship 34's flight did not revolutionize airlift doctrine. The Army Air Forces continued to emphasize standardized routes and formation flying, but the flight did contribute to a broader understanding that flexibility and adaptability could be as important as discipline. Post-war training incorporated more emphasis on terrain masking, low-altitude navigation, and contingency planning. The lesson was subtle but real. Approved procedures should be followed unless circumstances demanded otherwise, and recognizing those circumstances required judgment, experience, and the willingness to take calculated risks. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945 with a decisive Allied victory. The German offensive, which had initially shocked Allied command and threatened to reverse months of progress, ultimately failed. The Wehrmacht expended its remaining reserves in the Ardennes and gained nothing. The defense of Bastogne became one of the iconic moments of the battle, a symbol of American resilience and determination. But beneath the iconic narrative were thousands of individual decisions, made by soldiers and officers and air crews, that collectively determined the outcome. Kearns's decision to propose the forbidden route was one of those decisions. Brennan's decision to accept it was another. Neither man changed the course of the war alone, but they contributed to the result in a way that mattered, at a moment when it mattered most. The story of James Kearns and Ship 34 is not widely known. It appears in no major histories of the Battle of the Bulge. There are no monuments, no plaques, no formal recognition, and in some ways, that obscurity is fitting. War is shaped as much by the actions of ordinary people making difficult choices as by the decisions of generals and politicians. The navigator who studied a map and saw a possibility. The pilot who trusted him. The crew chief who kicked supply bundles out a door while shells exploded around him. These were not heroes in the cinematic sense. They were professionals doing their jobs under impossible conditions. But their story reveals something essential about how wars are fought and won. Doctrine matters. Training matters. Discipline matters. But so does the willingness to question, to adapt, to recognize when the approved plan is insufficient. The forbidden route was forbidden for legitimate reasons. Flying through that valley was dangerous, technically challenging, and against orders. But it was also effective. And effectiveness, in the end, is what saves lives. The men in Bastogne did not care which route the aircraft flew. They cared only that the supplies arrived. The plasma that saved a soldier bleeding out in an aid station was not more valuable because it arrived via an unauthorized route. The ammunition that stopped a German assault worked the same, regardless of how it reached the perimeter. Results mattered more than process. Yet the tension between innovation and discipline remains unresolved. In military organizations and beyond, rules exist to prevent chaos, to ensure coordination, to protect against reckless decisions. But rules can also become rigid, unable to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. The challenge is knowing when to follow them and when to set them aside. That judgment cannot be codified in doctrine or taught in a classroom. It emerges from experience, from understanding the intent behind the rules, and from accepting the consequences of deviation. James Kearns made that judgment in the cockpit of a C-47 on the morning of December 23, 1944. He proposed a route that violated orders because he believed it would save lives. He was proven right, but he could just as easily have been proven wrong, and then his decision would have been remembered as reckless rather than courageous. The line between those two assessments is thin, often visible only in hindsight. What remains is the simple fact of the flight itself. An aircraft threading through a narrow valley at treetop level, carrying supplies to men who desperately needed them, flown by a crew willing to take a risk that their commanders had forbidden. In the vast machinery of World War II, it was a small moment. But for the soldiers who received those supplies, for the wounded who lived because of the plasma, for the riflemen who held their positions because they had ammunition, it was everything. History remembers Bastogne. It remembers McAuliffe's defiant reply to the German ultimatum. It remembers the 101st Airborne's defense and Patton's dramatic relief. And it should remember those things, but it should also remember the quieter contributions, the nameless navigator, the unnamed valley, the forbidden route that became a lifeline. Because wars are won not just by grand strategies and famous battles, but by the accumulated actions of people who saw a problem and found a way to solve it. Rules or no rules. The sky over Bastogne cleared on December 23, 1944, and through that clear sky, one navigator found a path that no one else had seen. That was enough.